Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my full review of the Sony FE 50mm f1.4 G Master, a standard prime lens with a fast aperture designed for full-frame mirrorless cameras. I tested a final production model, and in this review I'll show you everything that I've learned about it. Announced in February 2023 at around $1,300, the 51.4 G Master becomes the latest in a wide range of lenses with a standard focal length or thereabouts. Sony alone has multiple 50s, from the entry-level 1.8 costing around $250 to the high-end 1.2 G Master at around $2,000. The new 51.4 GM slots roughly in between, still obviously a premium lens in the G Master series, but coming in smaller, lighter and cheaper than the 1.2 version. In Sony's own lineup, it most obviously goes up against the older Zeiss 51.4 ZA, launched 6 years previously and still selling somewhat optimistically for around $1,500. But I'd say its biggest rival will be Sigma's much more recent 51.4 DG-DN Art, which actually only came out a couple of weeks before the new Sony and is priced much more affordably at around $850. Indeed, the timing meant I was able to test both new 51.4 lenses side by side, allowing direct comparisons between them. So if you're looking for a standard prime lens for your Sony mirrorless camera, you've come to the right place. In terms of design, the Sony 51.4 GM shares a similar style to earlier models in the series, and is actually almost the same size and weight as the 35 1.4 GM. Here's the Sony 51.4 on the left with the Sigma 51.4 on the right, and while the Sony is 3mm wider in diameter, it's 14mm shorter than the Sigma and 154 grams lighter too, something you notice when picking them both up. This also makes the new Sony lens smaller and a substantial 284 grams lighter than the old Zeiss 51.4, which coincidentally shares a similar size and weight to the Sony 51.2. Bottom line, the new Sony 51.4 feels fairly compact and light for its specification. And now here's the two new 51.4s when they're fitted with their supplied lens hoods, where you'll also notice each has gone for a different approach. Sony's opted for a rubber-tipped cylinder versus a petal design on the Sigma, and while I didn't notice one being particularly more effective than the other in terms of blocking out stray light, I can say that the Sony hood does allow you to securely stand the lens upside down on a flat surface, something you wouldn't want to attempt with the Sigma, especially when it's mounted on a body. Both lenses are also supplied with padded bags. Both lenses share similar controls too, including an aperture ring from f1.4 to f16, which can be locked in an A position for body-based control, or declicked for smooth and silent operation. Sony, however, includes two focus hold buttons versus just one on the Sigma. Towards the end of the barrel is a very smooth and lightly damped manual focusing ring with linear response. Sigma's manual focusing ring is wider but stiffer in operation and requires a broader turn to get from near to far. It's a personal choice, but I prefer the Sony ring. At the end of the barrels is a 67mm filter thread on the Sony versus 72mm on the Sigma, and both lenses also feature dust and weather resistance that includes a rubber seal at the lens mount. Now for autofocus, and you're looking at the Sony 51.4 GM on an A7 IV body set to single area and single autofocus mode, pulling focus between the two bottles. There's a little wobble as it returns to the closest bottle at times, but I found switching the AF mode to continuous AFC eliminated that and reduced the overall time to focus from one subject to another. For comparison, here's the Sony on the left and the Sigma on the right, both set to AFC where they focused at their fastest, and they're both looking pretty good here. Impressively, the Sigma actually looks a tad faster. It's certainly not the poor cousin in terms of speed. Now for the same test but for video, where the camera is set to continuous autofocus. As you'd expect, the focus pulling is smooth and accurate, and I can confirm it was essentially silent in operation. Place the Sony on the left and the Sigma on the right, and you'll see that both lenses are pretty evenly matched here, with any speed or response time being adjustable in camera if desired. You can also get an idea of focus breathing, which I'll talk more about in just a moment. Next, for face tracking, here filming video with the Sony 51.4 GM, where you can see the camera and lens effortlessly keeping me in sharp focus as I move around the frame, while rendering the background into an attractive looking blur. And again, here's the Sony on the left and the Sigma on the right, proving both are equally adept at this particular task, capturing fine details on my face and providing plenty of background blur for isolation. I'll show you a stills portrait comparison in just a moment, but for now it's clear how both lenses can be great for presenting pieces to camera. Some of you may be wondering how the depth of field compares to the faster 1.2 GM, so I've swapped in an earlier test here that I've made with it on the right, keeping the 1.4 G Master on the left. Now these were filmed 2 years apart, so aren't directly comparable, but it does give you an idea nonetheless. As I move back and forth in these clips, you can also get another idea of focus breathing in a real-life environment. As an extreme test of focus breathing though, I'll now manually focus the Sony FE 1.4 from infinity to the closest distance and back again here, where you'll see a reduction in the field of view as I focus closer, almost as if you're zooming a lens to a longer focal length. While this effect won't bother stills photographers, it can become a distraction in some videos as you pull focus from one subject to another, and it also seems to be a compromise that Sony's happy to make on many of its lenses. But let's compare it to the Sigma, focusing more slowly here due to its longer throw on the manual focusing ring, and you'll see it suffers from even worse breathing than the Sony when you're focusing between infinity and the closest distance. Sony also has an extra trick up its sleeve though, with digital compensation available on the more recent bodies. Here's how it looks on the left without breathing compensation, and on the right with the feature enabled on the A7 IV. You'll notice a mild crop to the field of view, but as I adjust the focus from infinity to the closest and back again, the corrected version on the right exhibits virtually no change in magnification. So for good measure, here's my earlier bottle focus test, on the left without breathing compensation, and on the right with it enabled. Again, of course, there's a crop in order for the camera to work its magic, but the breathing compensation really does work in practice, but it is only available on supported Sony lenses only and does not work on the Sigma. This could be a decider for some videographers, although again, it won't affect anybody capturing still photos and may not even be an issue for video either if the change in focus is less extreme. Now for my landscape quality test, shot from about 140 meters away. Now I always like to test lenses with real life subjects both near and far to see how they'll perform in practice, and I've angled the view here so that details run into the corners. I've used the Sony lens with distortion compensation set to off as the lens performed perfectly well without it. You're looking at the Sony FE 1.4 GM here, wide open at f1.4 on the A7 IV, and if we zoom in for a closer look in the centre of the frame, where I focus the lens, you'll see crisp details right out of the gate. Place the Sony on the left and the Sigma on the right though, and you'll see that both lenses are performing at a very high level here, and as I gradually close their apertures, one stop at a time, there's little to be gained in the middle. Let's return to the Sony lens at f1.4 before heading out into the far corner, where you'll see the details soften a tad, but more notably a darkening due to vignetting. Place the Sony on the left and the Sigma on the right though, and you'll see that the Sigma suffers from even greater vignetting. Now to be fair, it's not unusual for large aperture lenses, and you can see the effect gradually reduce as I close the aperture one stop at a time. Note that you're seeing a slightly different part of the frame on the Sigma samples as it captured a fractionally smaller field of view in my tests, whether compensation was applied to both lenses or not. It's not unusual for two lenses of the same quoted focal length to capture slightly different coverage in practice, so don't worry about it here, I just wanted to mention the difference. I'd say both lenses are already looking pretty good by f2.8, and there's some improvements up to f5.6 if you're looking right across the entire frame. Bottom line, both lenses are excellent performers in this environment. 50mm lenses are also a popular choice for close-range portraits or smaller group shots, and while they lack the compression and isolation of longer focal lengths, some photographers, myself included, actually prefer their more engaging perspective, while a fast f1.4 aperture can still deliver decent blurring in the background. You've already seen the 1.4 GM in action for video earlier, so here it is for a stills portrait, where it's clear the degree of blurring that you can achieve at f1.4, even when the background's only a few meters distant. Putting the Sony on the left and the Sigma on the right, both taken from the same distance, shows they share a pretty similar style in terms of rendering, with little to choose between them here. Do you have a preference? But if you zoom in for a closer look, the Sony on the left is definitely capturing crisper details. Now some of this is down to what looks like more accurate focusing on my eyeball using the A7 IV's eye detection, but even when the depth of field is increased as I gradually close the aperture, the Sony on the left still looks sharper in this test than the Sigma on the right. Now that's not to say that the Sigma lens is soft, and when viewed in isolation or against other lenses it can actually look great. It's just that the Sony lens here is razor sharp and working very accurately and consistently with the eye autofocus in the camera. Just before moving on, a quick look at a similar portrait that I took a few years earlier with the Sony FE 1.2 G Master. Obviously I'm positioned further from the camera, but it does give you an idea of how that lens renders the background at its maximum aperture. Oh, and it too is razor sharp on the details, as indeed you'd hope for the price. For a closer look at the potential for bokeh and rendering, here's my ornament test where I position the lens near to its minimum focusing distance. You're looking at the Sony FE 1.4 GM here with its aperture fully open to f1.4, where the fairy lights are transformed into large bokeh blobs with fairly well defined edges and only the slightest hint of textures within if you're looking really closely. Place the Sony on the left and the Sigma on the right, both taken from the same distance, and you'll see their rendering style is quite similar at first glance. Look really closely though and you'll notice the Sigma's blobs have a slightly softer edge to them, which you may or may not prefer to the slightly more defined outlines on the Sony, but I'd personally say there's no deciding factor between them. Both are capable of delivering good looking bokeh blobs at their maximum apertures. As the apertures are gradually closed one stop at a time, you'll see both lenses lose the elongated blob shapes towards the corners for more uniform circles across the frame. Both lenses actually employ 11-bladed diaphragm systems, which occasionally become slightly visible at certain apertures, but on the whole, both models manage to produce mostly circular blobs at smaller apertures. Oh, and in case you were wondering, here's how the FE 1.2 looks with the same test. If you're looking for bokeh blobs at more of a portrait distance, here's how the Sony and Sigma FE 1.4s look when filming video with their apertures wide open, rendering the lights behind me into attractive looking blobs. Both lenses are ideal for presenting pieces to camera from a tripod with nice blurred backgrounds. And just for fun, here's the Sony FE 1.2 G Master once again at 1.2. Moving on to macro, Sony quotes a closest focusing distance of 40 cm for the lens in autofocus or 38 in manual focus, but I always like to check the performance at the minimum distance by simply photographing a ruler as close as I can manually focus on it. Here's the result that I got with the Sony FE 1.4 GM, where I could reproduce a subject measuring 193mm across the width of the frame. Now let's add the Sigma FE 1.4 above, again with the aperture wide open and positioned as close as I could focus on it, and the result is actually almost identical. For the record, I measure 192mm for the Sigma here, but that's within testing error between them. Sigma quotes a closest focusing distance of 45 cm, but the effect of focus breathing and a slightly smaller field of view to start with has actually ended up delivering much the same magnification in practice. You'll notice both lenses become softer towards the edges from this distance when operating at their maximum apertures, but if you close down the aperture, for example to f8 here, they both sharpen up nicely. Before my final verdict, I wanted to show a couple of examples at f1.4 where lateral chromatic aberrations could possibly raise their ugly heads. Now, while you can photograph charts to trigger this more obviously, I wanted to see what the impact would be in real life. And I'd say from these shots there's minimal evidence of any here to worry about on the Sony. Just briefly, here's an enlarged view of the Sony at the bottom and the Sigma at the top, again both at f1.4, and while the Sigma is showing a fraction more colour in the blurred areas than the Sony, it really is pretty minimal and I wouldn't personally consider it an issue. Would you? Okay, now it's time for my final verdict, during which I'll show you a selection of images that I took with the Sony 50mm 1.4 G Master on an A7 IV, and as always, if you'd like a closer look, you can access some of the originals via my review page for the lens at cameralabs.com. I also took a similar series of shots with the Sigma 50 1.4 DGDN-R on the same day, allowing you to make loads of comparisons between them. So check them out and let me know which you think looks best. The Sony 50mm 1.4 G Master is a welcome addition to the system, slotting roughly between entry-level and high-end models in price, but with minimal compromises in terms of optical quality. Indeed, in my tests I was reminded throughout of the 1.2 G Master, with the new 1.4 version delivering similarly razor-sharp details and attractive rendering, not to mention fast and accurate focusing and decent build quality. Like many Sony lenses, the only real issue is substantial focus breathing, but this may not actually be an issue for you depending on how you shoot, plus the more recent bodies do offer effective digital correction for it if you desire. Personally speaking, I much prefer the new 51.4 GM to the old Zeiss 51.4 and wouldn't feel the need to stretch further to the 1.2 model. Sure, you miss out on f1.2 bragging rights, but I'd prefer to brag about the cost saving, not to mention the smaller and lighter barrel, and I defy anyone to honestly look at a portrait from the new 51.4 GM and criticise it for not being sharp enough on the details or having a sufficiently blurred background. But of course, your mileage may vary. So within Sony's own range, the new 51.4 GM is a triumph, but outside it faces stiff competition from Sigma's 51.4 DG-DN Art, launched only a couple of weeks earlier at a comfortably lower price of around $850 or pounds. Side by side in my tests, the Sony delivered crisper details on portraits, a little less vignetting at 1.4, a tad less bokeh. It supports focus breathing compensation and is a little smaller and lighter too, but equally I was struck by how close they were in many other respects. Only you can decide whether those benefits of the Sony are worth spending the extra on. Ultimately, you wait ages for a high quality 51.4 that won't break the bank, and then two come along at once. I'd honestly be delighted with either model, and the sheer fact that Sony owners now have this choice when there's still no native 51.4 for Canon RF or Nikon Z is testament to the flexibility of the E-mount system. And that's it for this lens review. Let me know what you think of both lenses in the comments, and if you found any of my reviews useful, please do consider giving this video a like and my channel a follow. And if I've helped you make a decision on a pricey bit of kit, don't forget that you could always treat me to a cup of coffee, or treat yourself to a Camera Labs t-shirt, or indeed a copy of my in-camera photography book. There's links to everything, including the latest pricing, in the description. Oh, and don't forget to also check out my Sigma 50mm 1.4 DG-DN art review to see how that model directly compares with a bunch of very similar sample images. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.